So welcome to the lecture on photosynthesis. So we've already talked about cellular respiration and how organisms take energy in the form of glucose or lipids or proteins or nucleic acids, whatever form it may be in, and they break it down and convert it into ATP. Well, think about glucose. It's got to come from somewhere. So do those lipids and those other products or foods or things that can be used as a source of energy. Well, photosynthesis is the pathway that makes a lot of those things. So when we look at photosynthesis, the sun is considered the ultimate source of energy for the majority of life on Earth. Now, 20 years ago, that statement would have been the sun is the ultimate source of energy for all life on Earth. But with new knowledge being gained in the scientific community, we're learning there's other things that can make energy, or other ways of making energy that don't necessarily rely on the sun. But for humans, in all general purposes, our energy is derived from the sun. Not directly. We don't get energy directly from the sun, but indirectly. We eat things that used sun. Or we eat something that ate something that used the sun to produce its energy. So consider the sunflower growing there. Some of us may eat sunflower seeds. You're using or eating that plant, the seeds, to obtain carbohydrates, possibly lipids and proteins. You're getting nucleic acids as well. And then your body is going to use those things in cellular respiration to make ATP. The sun, though, is what enabled the plant to grow and produce those carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, etc. So what we're going to explore here in photosynthesis are organisms that use this pathway. Don't just focus on plants. I want you guys to make sure you recognize there are a lot of other producers out there. So producer is a term we want to get more comfortable with, not just focusing strictly on plants. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the different types of photosynthesis. Believe it or not, there's actually one that's called anoxygenic photosynthesis. So anoxygenic photosynthesis is a type of photosynthesis in which oxygen is not actually produced. The organisms, and this is primarily going to be found in purple bacteria, these green sulfur bacteria, heliobacteria, very selective groups of bacteria. It's fairly restricted, fairly limited, with just a handful of different bacterial types using this, but do want to mention it here. So anoxygenic describes photosynthesis in these bacterial types in which the electron flow goes in this circle. It's what we'll call cyclic, and they're all transferred back to the single reaction center, and oxygen is not produced. So it's this old system, what we call the cyclic system of photosynthesis. Very simple, very primitive. No oxygen is given off during this process. So it makes it a little bit different, a little bit unique when we look at these organisms that run this pathway. So I'll show you this in just a little bit, but by and large, the primary photosynthesis pathway is oxygenic photosynthesis. This is the traditional pathway that we think of when we look at plants. So there's cornfield in springtime. We look at some of the bacteria or algae or this little oval-shaped creature down on the bottom. This is Euglena, member of the kingdom Protista, and it's going to run oxygenic photosynthesis in which oxygen is given off as a byproduct of the pathway. Okay? So our main focus with photosynthesis will be oxygenic. So again, look at briefly the anoxygenic, but primarily we want to focus on the oxygenic photosynthesis. Okay, so photosynthesis in general has three stages, three kind of broad stages or categories or things that have to happen for the entire pathway to work. Stage one is capturing sunlight. So the organism has to have a mechanism in place in which it can capture sunlight. Stage 2 is making ATP and these little structures called NADPH. Now, in cellular respiration, we talked about NADH. That was a little wheelbarrow. In photosynthesis, NADPH is the plant version of the wheelbarrow. It's a carrier. It picks up hydrogens and electrons and carries them from one part of the reaction to another part of the reaction. So it's going to do the same basic function, the same basic thing that we saw back in cellular respiration. Our third stage of photosynthesis is formation of glucose. So taking carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and pushing it together in order to create a glucose molecule, C6H12O6. 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, 6 oxygens. Those get pushed together, bonded to each other, and that creates that little glucose molecule. Once it has glucose, there's a whole list of things that can happen to that glucose molecule. Okay, so like I said, when we look at photosynthesis, we look at the big overall picture. We want to look at these 3 stages, and we'll talk about how each stage works and kind of the finer details of each of the stages. Just like with respiration, I'm not going to ask you guys to know every single step of the pathway, but the big picture. What goes in, what comes out, what structures are necessary, and then we'll put some application to this pathway and say, well, how do plants survive in different environments? How are they adapted to unique environments? It's because they have found ways to, we could say, tweak or modify the photosynthesis pathway. And that gives them the ability to survive in deserts versus rainforests versus our backyard in Illinois here. Okay, so we'll get some application in some of the later lectures associated with this particular unit. But to do this pathway, the key structure is the chloroplast. It's that little green disc. Looks like a little oval down there. Chloroplasts are what give plants their green color. That's it. That's the structure. It's going to have 2 membranes. There's an outer membrane and an inner membrane. Both membranes are made up of phospholipids. So the chloroplast is very analogous or comparable to the mitochondria. It's got that membrane system. It's a unique little structure that is the powerhouse. Now, I do want to point out, and I want to make sure you guys can see it on this picture, so let me do a little insert here. Let's get a little arrow. Alright, so here's our plant cell. Notice right there at the tip of the arrow. Let me increase the font size. Make it thick. Let's make that arrow red. Notice the mitochondria. Plants have mitochondria. They can run photosynthesis with the mitochondria. Or no, I'm sorry, they can run cellular respiration with the mitochondria. They can also run photosynthesis with these chloroplasts. So plants have 2 ways of producing energy. 2 sources. Mitochondria for cellular respiration and chloroplasts for photosynthesis. Animals typically don't have this. As a human, we're not green. We don't have chloroplasts. We cannot run photosynthesis. So the key structure are these little green ovals. They're primarily found in the leaves of plants. Sometimes they'll be in the stems, depending upon the plant type, but primarily the leaves. And when our trees and plants drop their leaves and they go dormant in the fall here in Illinois, they're done running photosynthesis. They go into hibernation or a dormancy period, and they wait until next year. And notice the early spring, the first thing that really happens is the leaves develop and they are green because they're full of chloroplasts and they're running photosynthesis. So scientists are struggling, or I wouldn't say struggling, they're constantly reevaluating classification. Something I've mentioned before, we'll keep talking about it, especially when we get into genetics and biotechnology. Classification becomes really, really crazy. But what do you do with an animal that has chloroplasts? Is it no longer an animal? Is it a plant? How do we classify it? So here's an example. This little sea slug here in my hand, it's a slug. It's similar to the snails and slugs we have living in Illinois in our backyards. But this little guy's a marine slug, lives in the ocean. It crawls around eating algae. It consumes it, uses cellular respiration to make ATP, but then it can also make chloroplasts. And those chloroplasts get embedded into the skin of the slug, giving it that green color. So if the slug doesn't have a large amount of food available, it can simply run photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide is available, water, sunlight, chloroplast. There's your reaction. Pathway works. And oxygen and glucose are being produced in the skin of the slug. That diffuses into the bloodstream, goes to whichever cells need it, and those cells are running cellular respiration. So the amazing thing about this slug is when researchers first started studying it, they said, well, the slug eats the algae and that's where it gets its chloroplast, and that's really not making chloroplasts, it's just simply hijacking and using chloroplasts from algae. And then the chloroplast eventually got old, worn out, disintegrated, and the slug didn't have its color anymore, it wasn't green. But as they continued to study these slugs for decades, imagine that as a career for being a biologist, as you study slugs, but they discovered that the slugs evolved the genetic ability to produce their own chloroplast. So that slug there does not need to eat a chloroplast in order for it to get that into its body. It can make it on its own. So if you keep the slugs in a fish tank with no algae, they will produce chloroplasts. They will build their own chloroplasts. They can photosynthesize and make energy from the sun. So we go back to classification. Is this an animal? Is this a plant? Or do we create a new level of classification for this thing? Maybe it's a planimal, half plant, half animal, something in between both of those kingdoms. Now, the hypothetical is, what if people could run photosynthesis? So there's our Hulk. He's green. Why is he green? That's just the color that people made him when they first created the cartoon character or the comic book character. But imagine if we were able to do this with people. Change a gene in each of us. Turn on a gene or implant a gene or modify a gene or do something with our genetics to enable us to produce chloroplasts in our skin. Now, I don't know if we'd want to do it across the whole body or maybe just your arms or a certain body part, your legs, your back, whatever. If you expose that body part to the sun, you're going to run photosynthesis. There's plenty of carbon dioxide in the bloodstream. There's water in the bloodstream. There's sunlight. You got your chloroplast. Those are your four ingredients. Water, sunlight, carbon dioxide, and a chloroplast. Those things are there. It will run photosynthesis. ATP gets produced, and glucose and oxygen get produced at the cellular level, which means those two products go directly into your bloodstream. Once it's in the bloodstream, it goes to whatever cells need it. Those cells take the oxygen and the glucose, and they switch on cellular respiration and pump out more ATP. So imagine, instead of saying, hey, I'm going to Subway for lunch, I'm going to go outside and put my arms in the sun for 20 minutes, and I'm going to eat. And that's all you have to do. Think about how much money we would save. But on the global scale, consider how this could change hunger issues across our planet. If this was possible, we wouldn't have to worry so much about some of the hunger problems and the food issues we are seeing on this planet. Right? So, who wants to be green.